Hi guys, welcome to your first PowerPoint on the Age of Absolutism. Today we're mainly going to be focusing on the absolute monarchs, of course we're going to start with none other than Louis XIV. So to give you the ideas of the foundations of absolutism, I need you to watch this first video here by Tom Ritchie. Basically, you need to write a brief summary on it, explaining to me, proving to me that you watched it. And then, of course, the next video on Louis XIV. Now, the PowerPoint will be able to touch on a lot of the points that he's discussing, but I want you to watch the video to kind of fill in the blanks on the things that I miss. So those are two of the videos that you need to watch tonight. I have two more later on in the PowerPoint, so 4 videos total that you will need to be able to show to me in class tomorrow. Let's talk about the Sun King, Louis XIV. That's also what he was known as. So at the age of 5, he was the one who took power in France. Of course, you're not able to rule as king at 5 years old. So he had regents, and probably one of the most important regents that you are familiar with would be Cardinal Richelieu. Throughout his youth, it's important to understand that his power was often threatened by nobles. They saw this as an opportunity to usurp the throne. In other words, a 5-year-old can't rule, so maybe they could try to take over, and they were going to try to dominate Europe so that they wouldn't be dominated by the monarchs. This is also known as what is called the Frondes. So these were 3 revolts that were led by nobles specifically against Louis XIV and the monarchy. And so the Frondes were very influential in Louis's life, because when he saw this happen, he knew then that once he became king, or was old enough to rule as king, that he would have to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. Often the nobles were very competitive with one another, and so really ultimately they were not able to organize themselves or create any type of organized way to overthrow Louis's government. So they were able to stop the Frondes, and ultimately they were not successful. But the seed had been planted, and Louis wanted to make sure that nothing like this would ever happen again. Of these 3 revolts, Louis learned a very important lesson. He knew that he should never trust nobility, and that he needed to create an absolute monarchy where nobles would not have as much power as the king. An absolute monarchy, as you learned from Tom Ritchie's video, is where a king or queen rules and has total power over events. Now, this is going to be very difficult in a country as large as France. So there are going to be some privileges that Louis is going to allow the nobility to have, but ultimately he was able to control it in several different ways, and that's what we're going to talk about. By the age of 23, he had already become the most extreme absolute ruler in French history, more than any other king before him, at a very young age. And as I mentioned before, a large part of that is because of what he witnessed as a child with the Fronde. He often said, "I am the state." This is probably his most famous saying or most famous quote, meaning that he controlled all, and basically he was France. And I'm going to give you several examples of how this was in fact very true. One of the ways that he was able to control the financial aspect of France was by using mercantilism. Remember, in mercantilism, the government controls the economy. And he was building France's economy to several new heights by controlling it himself and not allowing for any type of capitalism or people to control the money. So he controlled the taxes, he controlled the revenue from any colonies around the world. Ultimately, that is how he was making money. He used the wealth of France, however, not only to make France better, but ultimately to make his life better. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. He had a collection, first of all, of over 500 cooks. It was known that he lived a very lavish lifestyle. In class, actually, we're going to read together a day in the life of Louis XIV, so you could see just how elaborate it was. He also had over 100 nobles that waited every single morning to help him dress. Yes, you heard me right. They would literally wait outside of his bedroom with the hopes to be chosen to help him, for example, just put on his shoes. And this is one of the ways that he was able to control the nobility. He was very, very sneaky in doing. But the ultimate way that he was able to spend money on himself was to show the world his power by building the Palace of Versailles. And this is an artist's rendition of what Versailles looked like. It was known for its elaborate gardens and fountains and thousands of rooms, and he built this just outside of Paris. It still exists today and is open for tours for the public. The capital of France was now moved to the Palace of Versailles. So this is another way that he was able to control the nobility, by moving them away from the city of Paris and forcing the nobles to move in with him in his personal palace in Versailles. He did this for two reasons. Number one, he didn't want to be bothered with the problems of his subjects. He was a very fancy man, I guess you could say. You can see that in several of the pictures that we see of him with his shoes and his elaborate clothing and his 500 cooks. And so he didn't want to look at the faces of the poor people. He didn't want to look outside and walk through the streets of Paris and see the suffering that his subjects had to deal with. He just couldn't be bothered with it. And also, as I mentioned before, he forced the nobles to move to Versailles as well, and this allowed him to control them, all the way down from what they ate to when they met, and even, of course, giving them the honor and the privilege to dress him in the morning. The palace itself was absolutely enormous. It was 500 yards in length. This is one of the famous rooms known as the Hall of Mirrors. And so literally you can walk up and down this hallway, and it's known as the Hall of Mirrors. Mirrors were very expensive back then, and each of them too are inlaid with gold. And so very expensive room, but also an opportunity for him to look at himself in the mirror as he walked down the hallway. And it cost $2 billion to build. So imagine just how much money needed to be spent for this palace to be built and also run by the servants and the cooks and so forth. It was 25% of the entire wealth of France that went into just this one home. Unbelievable. He actually almost bankrupted France because of it. But ultimately, this was the best way for him to show off his power. It took 36,000 people to build it, and it is home to over 2,000 rooms. And that's not just bedrooms, that's rooms entirely. And here is the entrance into the Hall of Mirrors. You can see the elaborateness with the chandeliers and the Baroque details. It's just absolutely everywhere. There are also 15,000 acres of gardens, and he would use those gardens to take daily walks with his nobles, or he would also use the forests nearby to hunt, because that was something that he enjoyed as well. And there are over 1,400 fountains. As I mentioned before, the most famous part of Versailles is the Hall of Mirrors, and here's another angle of that particular room. You can see the chandeliers and the gold ornaments and so forth. There were a lot of outrageous traditions that took place. He was a very detail-oriented king, and he had elaborate, what's the word I'm looking for? He had elaborate routines that took place almost every single morning, every single day. Everything had to happen at the exact time. At the commands of him, and this all existed in the Palace of Versailles. This is a picture of his bedroom, by the way, and tomorrow in class I will read you a handout that goes into detail about these elaborate traditions. It's quite fascinating. So it was truly something that all European kings wished for, and following suit with Louis XIV, there's going to be several other absolute rulers who wind up building palaces of their own just to try to be like him. Because he was so powerful, this is why he was given the nickname the Sun King, kind of like the sun doesn't set unless Louis says so. or basically that his power was overreaching over all of his kingdom. And he had quite the fashion sense as well, as you can see from this picture. During his reign, just a couple of things that are important to note about Louis when he was king. French explorers navigated up along the Mississippi River, and the state of Louisiana is actually named in his honor, in case you were wondering where that came from. And it is important, remember I said that he would often call himself the state. I am the state. And so not only was he France, but he was every aspect of France, including the church. So he considered himself to be the head of the Catholic Church, and really stated that the Pope had no real authority over the church in France, but ultimately he was the one who made decisions for the Catholic Church in France. Children were also forced to be raised Catholic, and most Huguenots were either converted or they even fled France, as I mentioned before. Don't worry about that page number. That's with your previous textbook. I'll share that with you in class tomorrow as well. So he also controlled an army of over 400,000 trained soldiers. This was the largest army in Europe. And as we mentioned, after the 30 Years' War, France had become the most powerful nation in Europe, and a large part of that was due to the fact that they had such a strong and powerful army. And this is going to continue even through Napoleon as well, because he's also going to be a strong military commander. So the 400,000 trained soldiers are going to fight in several different wars, and we're going to talk about one right now. So in 1700, the King of Spain wound up dying without an heir. And so as a result, that ended the Habsburg rule in Spain. Now, Spain was already weak. Remember, we talked about how they started to weaken after the 30 Years' War. And now with the Habsburg ruler dying off with no legitimate heir, this left an opportunity open. Louis claimed that his half-Habsburg grandson, Philip, could be the rightful heir to Spain, because what had happened was Louis's son had married a Habsburg princess, and they gave birth to a son named Philip, and therefore he said, well, he's Habsburg, so he is the rightful heir to the Spanish throne. But I want you to think about that. Why would the rest of Europe not want this to happen? Well, they feared that a combined French and Spanish throne would lead to Bourbons controlling all of Europe. Just like before, they were very concerned that the Habsburgs could potentially control all of Europe. Now the Bourbon dynasty was showing to be a real threat. And so many people were not going to allow this to happen. And so as a result, the surrounding nations, including England, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire, came together, and they formed what is known as the Grand Alliance. And so this is kind of a precursor to the alliance system that's going to happen later on in the world wars. But it shows you that the European nations had the ability to come together against a common cause. And the cause in this case was to try to prevent the Bourbons from taking over Spain. This is known as the War of Spanish Succession. And that is what began at this point when the Grand Alliance was formed. These are the other two videos that I want you to watch. Tom Ritchie does a great job in explaining the details of the War of Spanish Succession. I want you to write a summary of that video. And then there were other wars that Louis XIV fought in as well. That's the only one I'm going to discuss, but Tom Ritchie will discuss the other wars with you. So I want you to watch that video also. I will put both of these videos in the description. So at first, in the War of Spanish Succession, the French were extremely successful, and it looked as if they were going to win. But eventually, I'm going to spare you the gory details, eventually the Grand Alliance was able to halt the French armies and prevent them from taking over Spain. So Louis decided to sign a treaty. This is known as the Treaty of Utrecht. It was signed in 1713, and this is considered to be the most important peace treaty since the Treaty of Westphalia. And the reason for that is because, just like I mentioned before, it prevented a takeover of Europe by the Bourbon monarchy. However, on the treaty, Philip, also known as Philip V, which happened to be Louis's grandson, he was allowed to become the king of Spain. But the other side of the treaty it is important to note that to this day, the Bourbon family still sits on the Spanish throne. France, however, is important to know that they still were the most powerful nation in the world. Even though they had technically, I guess you could say, lost the War of Spanish Succession, and they did make them a little bit weaker, they still were very, very powerful. England ultimately was the big winner in the war because one of the things that they gained in the War of Spanish Succession was capturing Gibraltar. Many of you might be familiar with the Strait of Gibraltar, and therefore this gained them entry into the Mediterranean, hence advancing their powers as a powerful navy. England obviously was going to clearly be the dominant naval power in the world, especially having this access to the Mediterranean Sea. So France, the most powerful army, England, the most powerful navy. Shortly after the War of Spanish Succession, Louis XIV died, and he was 77 years old. So he certainly was able to accomplish a lot, and your book goes into much more detail about how he was able to control the nobility. But he ruled France for 72 years. This was the longest rulership of any monarch up to this point. Oh, that's the next slide. This was the longest that anyone had ever ruled any nation in all of European history. And to live to be 77 years old, that was a feat in itself because that was very rare during that time period. He had outlived all of his children, so none of his sons were able to take over the throne because they died before he did. And he outlived even his grandchildren as well. So therefore, the next ruler of France was going to be his great-grandchild. In this case, it was Louis XV. Louis XIV, we can definitely say, based on this few small amounts of information, is considered to be the most powerful absolute monarch in French history. It's debatable if it's in all of European history, but definitely in French history. But he is not the only absolute monarch. Tomorrow we're going to learn about absolute monarchs that were in Prussia, as well as in Austria, and then later in Russia as well. But this is one of the many absolute monarchs that ruled during the 16th and 17th centuries. So that wraps up our lesson on Louis XIV. Please make sure that you watch those 4 videos because they're going to go into much more detail, as well as read the required pages in your textbook. And I will see you guys tomorrow.